It was a sunny Saturday morning when we finally pulled into the driveway of our new home. My wife Alyssa and I had been saving for years to buy a house together, and this quiet suburban neighborhood seemed like the perfect place to begin our new chapter. The white picket fences, freshly trimmed lawns, and symmetrical houses looked like something out of a magazine. But as we stepped out of the moving van and onto the driveway, I couldn't help but notice the eyes watching us from behind curtains and across the street. A few neighbors stood on their porches, pretending to sip coffee or tend to their flower beds. But their gaze never left us. At first, I chalked it up to curiosity. Maybe they just weren't used to seeing new faces around here. I smiled and gave a polite wave, but most didn't wave back. One older man nodded slightly before disappearing behind his front door. We didn't let the awkward start bother us. Alyssa was glowing with excitement, talking about where to place the couch and which wall would be perfect for the wedding photos. We worked quickly, unloading the van and carrying boxes into the house. Around noon, we stopped to rest and eat sandwiches on the porch. That's when we saw Haran, older woman in her late 50s with sharp features, stiff posture, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a weapon. She marched across the lawn and stopped at the bottom step of our porch. "Are you the new owners?" she asked, her tone flat and cold. "Yes, we just moved in today," I said, standing up and offering a friendly smile. "I'm Daniel, and this is my wife Alyssa." Our eyes narrowed as she glanced at Alyssa, then back to me. "I'm Karen Ellsworth, president of the Homeowners Association. We weren't notified about any female tenant at this address." "She's not a tenant," I replied, trying not to sound offended. "She's my wife." Miss Ellsworth scribbled something on her clipboard. We were required to submit a list of all residents to the HOA prior to occupancy. "We take those rules very seriously. I thought that was only for renters." I asked. "No, it applies to all residents, including owners and spouses," she snapped. "Failure to comply could result in a fine." Alyssa shifted uncomfortably beside me. I took a deep breath and said, "We'll get everything sorted and send over the forms." We weren't aware of that specific rule. Karen didn't respond. Instead, she gave us one last scrutinizing look before turning on her heel and walking away. We watched her disappear down the street, clipboard still clutched tightly in her hand. That encounter left a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. Alyssa tried to brush it off with a joke, saying, "Well, there's our neighborhood welcome committee." But her laugh didn't sound genuine. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully. But the sense of being watched never really went away. A black SUV drove slowly past our house multiple times. A few doors down, a teenage girl sat on a porch swing, recording us with her phone. Every time we opened the front door, it felt like a dozen unseen eyes followed our every move. Later that evening, we received an email from the HOA, clearly from Karen Daling, a list of initial violations, including failing to notify the association of Alyssa's residency, having a moving truck parked too long in the driveway and playing disruptive music, which had only been our Bluetooth speaker playing soft jazz. It was our first day. We hadn't even finished unpacking. As Alyssa read the email aloud, her voice shook slightly. I put my arm around her and said, "We'll get through this. They don't know us yet." But deep down, I wondered if they even wanted to. It didn't take long for us to realize that Karen Ellsworth wasn't just the president of the HOA, she was the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Within days of moving in, we started to notice her presence everywhere. Whether we were walking to the mailbox or simply opening the garage, she always seemed to appear nearby, arms folded, eyes squinting with suspicion. Alyssa tried to stay positive, suggesting we bake cookies and introduce ourselves to some neighbors, but even that effort didn't go smoothly. When we brought a batch to the couple across the street, they accepted it awkwardly, muttered a polite thank you, and quickly closed the door. No small talk, no smiles, just silence. It felt like people were actively avoiding us. Couldn't figure out why. By the end of our first week, Karen had left 3 separate notices taped to our front door. One was about a trash bin being improperly placed. It had been visible from the street for less than an hour. Another cited Alyssa's car being parked at an angle in our own driveway. The last one was the most bizarre. Inappropriate curtains in the front window. They were just plain blue curtains we bought from a home goods store. But apparently they weren't neutral earth tones, which the HOA preferred for uniformity. Alyssa started to feel increasingly uncomfortable. while I was at work, Karen would occasionally stop by unannounced and knock. She'd pretend it was just a friendly check-in, but her questions always felt invasive. "Are you home alone today?" she once asked. Another time she commented, "I've never seen your name on the voter registry for this area. Are you legally residing here?" Lissa tried to remain polite, but I could see it was wearing her down. Things escalated when Karen began walking around the side of our house uninvited, claiming she was checking for fence line violations. One afternoon, Lissa looked out the kitchen window and saw Karen staring directly into our backyard from the alley, clipboard in hand, phone pointed in our direction. When confronted, she claimed she was documenting a possible code breach due to our patio chairs being placed too close to the fence line. I called Karen and told her plainly that she was crossing boundaries and that Alyssa felt harassed. Her response was dismissive and cold. "If your wife isn't used to HOA living, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for her," she said. That sentence lingered in my mind for days. What did she mean by that? Is there something more personal behind this hostility? No. Longer felt like she was enforcing community rules. It felt like she had a problem with Alyssa herself. Then, we started hearing stories. Quiet whispers from neighbors who spoke only when Karen wasn't around. One woman, who introduced herself as Rachel during a brief sidewalk chat, told us Karen had been involved in conflicts with several previous residents, most of whom eventually moved away. "She targets people," Rachel whispered.
Us.
"Anyone who doesn't fit her idea of what belongs here." I asked what that meant, but Rachel only shook her head and said, "You'll figure it out. Just document everything." From that day forward, we started keeping records, took photos of notices, saved emails, and began installing a few cameras of our own. It wasn't what we imagined when we dreamed of home ownership, but we knew. Now that this wasn't just about HOA rules, it was about control. Karen wasn't just the president of the association. She was watching us, testing us, waiting for a reason to make us leave. And we had no idea just how far she was willing to go. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything finally boiled over. The weather was warm, the sky cloudless, and for a brief moment, things almost felt normal. Alyssa had taken the day off work to do some gardening in the front yard. She loved flowers, roses, marigolds, and lavender especially, and had picked up a few pots from the local nursery earlier that week. She was kneeling by the walkway, gloves on, humming softly to herself as she placed fresh blooms into the soil. I was at work, but I remember her texting me a photo of her progress. "Making this place feel like ours," she wrote. It made me smile, but that peaceful moment didn't last. Karen showed up about 15 minutes later, according to the camera footage. She didn't knock or announce herself, she just stormed up the walkway like she owned the place. Alyssa looked up, surprised, and stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. "I'm sorry," Karen began, her voice already sharp, "but those flowers are not HOA approved. You're in violation of landscape regulations." Alyssa, still trying to be civil, asked what rule she had broken. Karen pulled a laminated document from her bag and waved it in front of her face. "All front-facing yards must maintain drought-resistant landscaping. Flowers like these attract bees, require watering, and are not permitted without prior approval." Alyssa tried to explain that they were planted in movable pots, not in the ground, and could be relocated if necessary. But Karen wasn't having it. Her voice grew louder, more aggressive. "You were already warned about non-compliance. Now you're ignoring regulations entirely. I'm writing you up again. This is your final notice before escalation." Alyssa stood her ground. "I haven't ignored anything. I've followed every single notice. You're just making this personal." And that was when Karen snapped. She took a step forward, pointing her finger in Alyssa's face. "Don't you dare accuse me of anything. You don't belong here. You've made that clear from the moment you moved in. Your attitude, your disregard for order, your entire presence is a disruption." That was the moment Alyssa pulled out her phone to start recording. Her hand shook slightly as she hit record and asked, calmly, "Are you threatening me?" Karen turned red, her jaw clenched. And instead of answering, she turned and stormed back toward the sidewalk. But she didn't go far. It's just a few feet. From the property line, she pulled out her own phone, dialed a number, and said, loud enough for the camera to pick up, Yes, I need police assistance. Shh. There's an aggressive woman at my location. She's yelling and threatening me. For my safety. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, Alyssa was still outside. 2 patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing, not sirens, but enough to draw attention from every house on the block. Neighbors began to gather on their porches, phones in hand, watching. Karen stood dramatically near the street, arms folded, her expression a mix of fear and smug satisfaction. The officer spoke to Alyssa first, then Karen, then reviewed the phone footage. Alyssa's calm demeanor, combined with the footage, clearly contradicted everything Karen had claimed. After nearly 20 minutes, the officers told Alyssa she was free to go and advised Karen to avoid false reporting. But there was no apology, no consequence. It's just a quiet, awkward standoff before everyone dispersed. When I got home and Alyssa told me everything, I felt a deep, cold anger I hadn't felt before. This wasn't about plants or regulations. Karen had called the police on my wife for gardening. She tried to portray her as dangerous, as someone unfit to be part of the community. And the worst part? No one stood up for her. Not a single neighbor came to her defense. That night I made a decision. Couldn't keep letting Karen control the narrative. If she was going to escalate things, then it was time we pushed back with truth, with proof, and with everything we had. The incident with the police had changed everything. Alyssa no longer felt safe walking outside alone, and I found myself constantly checking the security cameras we'd installed just days before. We started keeping the blinds drawn during the day, and every time we heard a knock or a door slam outside, we both flinched. We hadn't moved into a home we'd stepped into a war zone ruled by one woman with a clipboard and an ego the size of the neighborhood. But something else changed too. We began asking questions, quietly, carefully, and with growing suspicion. The way Karen had weaponized the HOA and the police made it clear this wasn't her first time doing it. So one evening after dinner, I walked over to Rachel's house, the woman who had once warned us to document everything. She opened the door cautiously, but when she saw it was me, she invited me in and offered me tea like she'd been waiting for this visit. "I figured you'd come eventually," she said. "You're not the first." "What do you mean?" I asked. Rachel pulled out a small plastic container filled with folded letters, notices, and copies of emails. She handed me a few to read. As I flipped through them, a disturbing pattern started to emerge. Multiple families who had moved in over the past 3 years had all received aggressive citations and harassment from the HOA within weeks of arriving. Most cases, the target was a woman, usually a spouse or partner who Karen claimed was not on record or disrupting HOA harmony. Most of them eventually sold their homes and left. One family even filed a restraining order, but it was dismissed due to lack of evidence. "She drives people out," Rachel explained. "Especially women she doesn't like, or who don't conform to her picture-perfect version of this neighborhood." "Why doesn't anyone speak up?" I asked. Rachel laughed softly, but it was hollow. "Because Karen's smart. She knows how to stay just within legal boundaries. And she's made herself valuable to the board. Keeps the HOA budget tight, handles paperwork, even helped the HOA avoid a lawsuit once by settling quietly. People are afraid of her. Some owe her favors, so others just want peace and stay out of her way." Over the next few days, I started talking to other neighbors carefully. Most were reluctant to say much at first. But a few, like an older man named Mr. Patel and a young couple with 2 kids, shared similar stories. Each had a tale of being corrected by Karen, of getting fined for tiny, sometimes imaginary infractions, and of feeling unwelcome in their own homes. But the biggest reveal came when I accessed public HOA records. I requested meeting minutes, disciplinary logs, and budget notes from the last 5 years legally required to be available to homeowners. What I found stunned me. Not only had Karen overseen more than 85% of all HOA violation notices, but several of them had questionable supporting documentation photos with metadata missing, timestamps that didn't match reported events, and signatures from witnesses who no longer lived in the neighborhood, even more suspicious. I found a pattern in property sales. 3 of the houses that had been vacated under Karen's watch had been resold within 6 months, and all 2 people linked to a single real estate firm. The kicker? Karen's sister-in-law worked there. I printed everything and put it into a binder, mails, testimonies, records, and photos. We finally had the beginning of a case, but we knew we couldn't do it alone. We needed to confront Karen publicly, where she couldn't twist the facts or manipulate the story. The next HOA meeting was in 2 weeks. That was our chance. Alyssa and I looked at each other determined. We were done being afraid. It was time to expose the truth. The night of the HOA meeting arrived with a quiet intensity neither Alyssa nor I could ignore. For 2 weeks we had prepared, relentlessly electing evidence, organizing documents, and speaking with the few neighbors who had shown a willingness to stand up. The binder we brought with us was thick and heavy, full of truth Karen had hidden for years behind her polished smile and authoritarian clipboard. The community clubhouse was fuller than usual. Word had spread about the incident involving the police, and a few people seemed curious, maybe even hopeful, that something was about to change. Karen, as always, sat at the head of the long conference table, flanked by 2 board members who, it looked like they would rather be anywhere else. She smiled politely as residents filed in, but her eyes narrowed when she saw us walk through the door. "Welcome, everyone," she began, tapping her pen against the gavel she never actually used. "Let's keep this short and civil. There are several items on tonight's agenda, including some complaints about property aesthetics, noise levels, and landscaping violations." I raised my hand immediately. Karen hesitated. "Yes, Mr. Taylor. I'd like to speak during open floor time. I have something important to share regarding HOA procedures and conduct." A few heads turned. Karen shifted in her seat. "Very well," she said tightly. "We'll hear from residents at the end." The next 40 minutes crawled by. Karen went through her usual motions: announcements, fine reports, maintenance updates, until finally she opened the floor. I stood up and walked to the front of the room, holding the binder tightly in one hand. Alyssa followed and sat beside a few supportive neighbors who nodded at her encouragingly. "Most of you know me," I began. "My wife and I moved in about a month ago. Since then, we've been targeted with citation after citation, most of which were vague, petty, or completely unsubstantiated. 2 weeks ago, the HOA president called 911 on my wife for planting flowers. Several people looked uncomfortable. One man shifted in his seat. Karen stared at me with a blank expression, but her jaw was clenched. At first, we thought we were alone. But then we started talking to others, residents who'd gone through the same pattern of harassment. We started finding things, inconsistencies in reports, records of fabricated violations, even property transfers that show a disturbing pattern of manipulation and profit. I opened the binder and began passing out copies of the documents. What we found is a system designed not to protect this community, but to control it. And one person has been at the center of it, abusing authority, intimidating residents, and in some cases, forcing them out of their homes. Karen stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. These are baseless accusations." "No," I said calmly. "These are documented facts. We've spoken to past residents. We've obtained public records, and we're not the only ones. Others here have experienced it too. It ends tonight." A heavy silence fell over the room. One board member leaned forward and flipped through the evidence. The other cleared his throat. "Karen," he said slowly, "is this true? Your sister-in-law's firm has purchased 3 former properties under your oversight." Karen's face went pale. "I've always acted in the best interest of this community." Rachel stood up in the back of the room. "No, you haven't. You've acted in your own interest. We've all stayed quiet too long." One by one, residents began to speak. Some told their own stories, others simply voiced their support. The board, sensing the shift, moved quickly. A vote was called to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. When the results were read, it was unanimous. Karen walked out of the clubhouse without a word. That night, something shifted. The silence that had ruled the neighborhood began to break. People talked to each other, laughed, welcomed us not just as new homeowners, but as neighbors. Alyssa stood beside me on our porch, watching the streetlights flicker on, and said softly, "I finally feel like we belong here." And this time, I believed her.